People say the average person in the Middle Ages lived to about 30. That sentence sounds clear. It is also deeply misleading, because it quietly suggests that life ended early, when in reality it was ended early, again and again before it had a chance to begin properly. Life expectancy was not a promise. It was a scar left by everything that went wrong first. Birth, childhood, disease, hunger, work. Why does one number erase all of that? Why does it make strong survivors look weak? And why do we still repeat it, as if dying young was the rule rather than the filter? People say the average person in the Middle Ages lived to about 30, and once that sentence is spoken, everything else tends to stop there, as if the number itself explains the experience, as if it captures what daily life felt like inside a body that woke up not knowing whether the year would finish with the same people still breathing. Because life expectancy was never something medieval people experienced forward in time. It was something calculated backward from losses that had already happened. Stacked early, heavy and uneven, the first mistake modern ears make is assuming that this number describes adults, when in truth it mostly describes children who never became them, because the most dangerous moment of medieval life was not old age or even illness later on. It was the simple act of arriving, of surviving birth, of making it through the first fragile years when the world applied its harshest pressure immediately, without warning or mercy in the Middle Ages. Birth was not a beginning, it was a gamble, and that gamble resolved quickly, sometimes within hours, sometimes within days, often before a child could be named with confidence, because naming someone who might not last the week carried a quiet emotional cost. One learned through repetition rather than philosophy, and this reality alone crushed life expectancy numbers long before adulthood ever entered the calculation. This is why asking what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages requires starting at the wrong end of life. Not with deathbeds, but with cradles, because the average collapsed early, dragged downward by infant mortality so severe that it reshaped the entire statistical landscape, making the world look shorter lived than it actually was for those who survived long enough to remember years instead of seasons. If half the children in a village never reached adolescence, the average life expectancy would sink dramatically, even if the other half lived into their 50s or 60s, and this is the part modern interpretations often skip, because averages feel intuitive while distributions do not, and yet distribution is where medieval life actually happened, unevenly, unfairly, and front-loaded with risk. Why does this matter? Because when we repeat that medieval people lived to 30, we unconsciously imagine adults aging rapidly and dying young, when the truth is colder and more uncomfortable. Many never reached adulthood at all, and those who did were not fragile survivors limping toward an early grave. They were bodies that had already passed through the most lethal filter. Their environment could impose. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not a protected phase. It was a prolonged exposure to disease, to hunger, to accidents, to work that began earlier than modern minds like to admit, and this exposure determined life expectancy far more decisively than anything that happened later, because once someone survived into their teens, the statistical odds shifted quietly but meaningfully. This is where the number 30 becomes misleading again, because it hides the turning point, the moment when survival probability improved. Not because the world became safer, but because the individual had already endured its worst conditions. The body that reached adulthood was not lucky in a romantic sense. It was conditioned, hardened, tested by repetition. When we ask what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, we are really asking how many chances a body had to be removed from the population early, and childhood offered the most. Disease did not arrive politely or predictably. There was no understanding of germs, no reliable treatment, no consistent prevention, and so fevers were negotiations rather than symptoms. Injuries were potential nentet rather than inconveniences. A small infection could escalate without warning, and families often realized something was wrong only after it had already passed the point of intervention. Not because they were careless, but because there was no framework for early detection. Illness did not announce itself as manageable. It simply appeared and then intensified nutrient compounded this risk quietly. Medieval diets for the majority were monotonous, heavy in grains, light in variety, sufficient for labor but not for resilience. And when harvests failed, The damage was cumulative rather than dramatic. Bodies weakened slowly, immune responses dulled, recovery times lengthened, all of which lowered the threshold at which disease became fatal. This is another reason life expectancy figures feel so brutal, because they compress slow weakening into sudden disappearance. Hunger rarely killed directly. It prepared the body to lose later, and the statistics record only the loss, not the years of narrowing margins that preceded it. Work added its own pressure. Medieval labor was constant and physical, performed without ergonomic design or medical relief. Injuries accumulated rather than healed, and a body that could no longer work was a body at greater risk, because dependency itself was dangerous in a world without social safety nets, where survival depended on continued contribution. Again, this shaped life expectancy indirectly, not through spectacular deaths, but through vulnerability. A weakened body was less able to withstand illness, less able to recover from injury, less able to endure cold winters or bad seasons. And so the risk of early death remained present even after childhood, though no longer as concentrated. Women faced an additional layer of danger. That statistics also flattened childbirth. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not an occasional risk, it was a recurring one, repeated across a lifetime, each pregnancy reopening the possibility of fatal complications, and yet high birth rates were necessary precisely because so many children died young. This repetition mattered deeply for life expectancy calculations, because maternal mortality removed adults from the population at ages when survival might otherwise have continued for decades, and this removal was not random. It was biologically patterned, disproportionately affecting women regardless of strength or experience. When modern readers hear that life expectancy was low, they often imagine a society resigned to early death. But medieval people did not experience their lives as countdowns toward 30. They experienced them as negotiations year by year, season by season. Survival was not assumed, but neither was it limited by a specific age. Many adults lived into what we would now call old age. 50s, 60s, even 70s appear in records. And when they did, they were not anomalies. They were survivors of early filtering, proof that human lifespan itself had not changed dramatically, only access to it. This distinction is the heart of the question. What life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages depends entirely on where you look. At birth it was brutally low. After childhood it improved significantly, and for those who avoided disease, hunger, war, and repeated physical breakdown, life could extend much further than the famous number suggests. So why does the myth persist? Because a single number is easier to remember than a layered reality, and because averages offer emotional distance. They turn uneven suffering into something neat and abstract, something that sounds definitive while explaining very little. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not a promise of short life. It was a record of early loss and understanding that changes how we see the people who lived then, not as fragile, not as doomed, but as individuals moving through a world that tested them immediately and repeatedly, removing many early and leaving the rest to live on in bodies already shaped by survival. Bodies that did not expect longevity but did not rule it out either. And this is why the question cannot be answered by a number alone, because the real story of medieval life expectancy begins where most summaries stop and continues quietly through the lives of those who passed the first brutal filter and kept going while the statistics looked back and counted them as already gone. And once someone was counted as gone by those early losses, the remaining lives unfolded inside a very different statistical reality where danger did not disappear but redistributed itself across years instead of days, which is why understanding medieval life expectancy means tracing how risk changed shape over time rather than assuming it remained constant from birth to death. After childhood, the world did not suddenly become safe, but it did become slower in how it removed people because the most aggressive pressures had already done their work. Disease still circulated, hunger still returned, work still strained bodies, but the rate at which individuals were taken fell noticeably, and this shift is visible wherever records survive long enough to show it. This is where modern summaries often fail because they compress an uneven process into a flat number, and in doing so erase the difference between dying early and living long under constant threat, when in reality medieval life expectancy functioned more like a steep cliff followed by a long uneven plane, rather than a steady downward slope. If you survive the first years, your chances of seeing many more increased, not because of protection but because survival itself was cumulative. Every year lived was another year of resistance, built into the body and mind, immune responses strengthened, experience taught avoidance, and small adaptations mattered more than any single intervention. This does not mean medieval adults were healthy. By modern standards, they were simply less likely to be removed. Instantly, a fever was still dangerous, and injury could still turn fatal. But the body that had already endured childhood disease, malnutrition, and labor was better equipped to endure again. And this endurance shaped the real experience behind the statistics. Why then does the number 30 remain so persistent? Because it is clean, because it feels shocking, and because it allows modern audiences to feel superior distance rather than continuity. It frames the past as fundamentally other instead of structurally familiar under harsher conditions. When we look closely at adult life in the Middle Ages, what emerges is not constant collapse, but routine survival. People worked, married, raised children, argued, complained, aged, and adapted much as people do now, only with fewer margins for error and fewer buffers. When things went wrong, disease remained the dominant background. Presence, not as a single event, as a continuous pressure. Medieval towns and villages existed without sanitation systems, clean water guarantees, or an understanding of transmission. Illness did not arrive as an exception. It was part of the environment, and this environment shaped life expectancy year by year. Plagues capture attention because they were dramatic, but they were not the only forces at work. Smaller infections, respiratory illnesses, parasites, and fevers chipped away, constantly removing individuals whose bodies were already compromised by labor, hunger, or prior sickness. Medical practice did little to counter this, not because medieval people were foolish, but because knowledge was limited. Treatment often followed tradition rather than evidence, bloodletting, and herbal remedies were applied confidently, sometimes helping, sometimes harming, and often doing neither, in a way that changed long-term outcomes. What mattered more than treatment was exposure, how often someone encountered disease, how crowded their living conditions were, how strong their nutrition had been in the years before infection, and whether their body had enough reserve to recover. And these factors varied dramatically across population groups. Diet played a quiet but decisive role. Medieval food systems were fragile, dependent on harvest, success, weather, and storage. For most people, meals were repetitive and adequate only in good years, and this adequacy defined survival margins rather than strength. When food was sufficient, bodies endured. When it was scarce, immune systems weakened, recovery slowed, and minor illnesses became fatal, not immediately, but predictably, and these predictable failures accumulate into life. Expectancy figures that hide the process behind the outcome. Labor amplified this effect. Agricultural work, in particular, placed constant strain on the body. Injuries accumulated rather than healed, to be treated, but a state to be endured. A body worn down by decades of work was less able to survive illness and more likely to be counted among early adult deaths. Again, this is not sudden collapse, but gradual narrowing of options, and this narrowing determines life expectancy far more than dramatic events, because it increases vulnerability. Rather than guaranteeing removal, women experience this narrowing differently. Childbirth added a repeated high-risk factor to adult life. Each pregnancy reopened the possibility of fatal complications, and even when births succeeded, the physical costs remained cumulative. Maternal mortality removed women at ages when survival might otherwise have continued, and this pattern shaped average life expectancies quietly, but significant. War and violence also played a role. Though less constantly than popular imagination suggests, most medieval people were not soldiers, but conflict still reached them indirectly. Armies moved through countryside, resources were taken, crops destroyed, and young men were disproportionately removed during campaigns which skew adult survival patterns. Social class layered all of these risks unevenly. Those with access to better food, warmer shelter, less physically destructive work, and communal support lived longer, not because they were immune to disease, but because their bodies were less continuously degraded by survival itself. Clergy often outlived peasants, not due to holiness, but due to routine regular meals, shelter, and reduced labor. Monasteries functioned as early systems of stability, and this stability translated directly into extended life. Expectancy urban life offered mixed outcomes. Cities concentrated trade, opportunity, and food access, but also disease, crowding, and waste. Living in a city could extend life or shorten it, depending on timing and exposure, which again reinforces the idea. Therefore did exist, though it appeared unevenly. Those who reached it were not anomalies, but products of circumstance. Bodies that had either avoided or withstood the most damaging combinations of risk. They carried pain, limitation, and dependency, but they were present, respected, consulted, and visible in communities. This visibility matters because it contradicts the idea that medieval people rarely lived long. Instead, it shows that longevity was possible, but not evenly accessible. And this uneven access is exactly what life expectancy statistics compress out of view. So when asking what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the most accurate answer is that it depended entirely on when and how one survived early risk at birth and in childhood. It was brutally low after adolescence. It rose significantly, and across adulthood it remained conditional, shaped by exposure rather than age. This understanding reframes the past not as a place where everyone died young, but as a place where many died early, and those who did not often lived long enough to age, complain, remember, and teach. The number 30 therefore does not describe a lifespan. It describes a sorting process, a record of who was removed before life had time to stretch and who remained. To occupy the years beyond the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not a clock ticking down from birth. It was a filter applied early and relentlessly, and once passed it allowed a wide range of outcomes, including long lives, heavy with experience and endurance, understanding. This does not make medieval life easier or kinder, but it does make it clearer, and clarity matters because it replaces myth with structure and replaces distance with continuity, showing that the difference between then and now lies less in human capacity and more in the environments that decide how much of that capacity is allowed to unfold, while the body keeps negotiating for survival year after year, as the statistics wait behind to count what has already been lost and what remains unfinished. And because what remains unfinished is often more revealing than what is counted as complete, the next layer of medieval life expectancy appears when we stop asking how long people lived and start asking how long they were able to function as part of their world. Function mattered more than age because survival was practical. Before it was numerical, a person was alive not because they had reached a certain year, but because they could still work, still contribute, still move through daily routines without becoming an unsustainable burden. And this functional threshold shaped when death occurred as much as disease or hunger. In the Middle Ages, there was no clear boundary between living and dying the way modern medicine draws it today. Decline did not trigger intervention. It triggered adaptation. Families adjusted workloads, roles shifted, expectations narrowed, and a body could exist for years in a diminished state before finally disappearing from records, which again distorts how life expectancy looks in retrospect. Why does this matter? Because it explains why medieval people did not experience aging as a countdown toward a fixed end, but as a gradual negotiation with limits, and those limits were social as much as biological. When a body could no longer perform its role, sovereign depended on relationships, proximity, and tolerance rather than treatment. This is another reason why averages mislead. They register the endpoint, but not the extended period of partial survival that preceded it. When these drawn-out endings are compressed into a single number, they make life appear shorter than it was experienced. Consider injury. A broken bone today is an interruption in medieval life. It could be a turning point, not always fatal, but permanently altering capacity. An injured leg meant reduced mobility, reduced propensiety to cold, hunger, and illness. Over time, death followed, not as a direct consequence, but as a delayed result. These delayed consequences accumulate silently within life expectancy calculations, which count only the final outcome, while ignoring the chain that led there. And this chain was long, slow, and uneven. The same apply to illness. Many medieval diseases did not kill immediately. They weakened lungs, scarred organs, drained strength, and left survivors less able to endure the next challenge, which always arrived eventually. And this layering of damage explains why adult mortality remained high even after childhood risk declined. Yet even here, survival varied widely. Because environment mattered enormously, rural isolation could reduce exposure to certain diseases, while increasing vulnerability to famine. Urban density increased disease exposure. But improved access to food and trade, neither setting guaranteed longer life, both simply shifted the risk. Prove periods and weakened bodies. Warmer periods improved survival. Temporarily, these fluctuations show up as waves in mortality records, but are flattened out when averaged across generations. Why then do we continue to ask for a single answer to what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages? Because modern thinking is structured around planning decades ahead: retirement, education, long-term health. Medieval life was structured around immediate continuity: next harvest, next winter, next surviving child. This difference in time horizon changes how life is lived and remembered. Medieval people did not expect longevity, and this mindset allowed them to endure uncertainty without framing it as failure. When someone reached older age, it was not treated as an anomaly, but as an achievement that carried authority. Elders were respected, consulted, and relied upon precisely because they embodied survival knowledge, not because they were rare curiosities. Records of medieval communities show elders managing property, settling disputes, transmit skills and memories. Their presence contradicts the idea of a society empty before midlife and instead reveals a population thinned early but persistent afterward. This persistence is key to understanding medieval life expectancy to processes. And once that shift occurs, the familiar number loses its power to shock. 30 was not a wall people hit, it was a midpoint, pulled downward by early loss, and once those losses are acknowledged, the remaining lives stretch further than the average allows us to see. This also explains why medieval people did not appear obsessed with age. Counting birthdays mattered less than seasons. Survived children, grown strong, winters endured. Age was not ignored, but it was not central because it was not predictive. Modern societies track age because age predicts access. Medieval societies track capacity because capacity predicted survival. When applied backward, life expectancy is a tool designed for populations with stable records, predictable risks, and delayed mortality. Medieval populations had none of these conditions, and yet we apply the same metric and expect clarity. Clarity instead emerges when we reframe the question. What life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages becomes less about how long lives lasted and more about how survival was distributed across life stages. Early life was lethal, adulthood was conditional, old age was possible but uneven, and at no point was survival guaranteed. This structure explains the statistical outcome without reducing lived experience to a single claim. It also removes the implicit judgment that medieval people were weaker or less resilient. Human biology has not changed dramatically. What changed was exposure to uncontrollable risk. Once antibiotics, sanitation, nutrition, and safer childbirth entered the equation, early life mortality collapsed, and with it, average life expectancy mortality, DFI. When applied to the Middle Ages, it tells us how dangerous the environment was, not how limited the people were. Understanding this reframes the past as structurally harsh rather than biologically deficient. And it restores continuity between medieval and modern lives by showing that the difference lies in risk management, not in human potential. When the question is asked again what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the most honest answer is that it was fractured, brutal at the beginning, conditional in the middle, and surprisingly open. Ended at the end for those who reached it, the famous number survives because it simplifies this complexity into something repeatable. But repetition does not make it accurate, and accuracy requires holding multiple truths at once. Many died young, many lived long, and the average tells us very little about either. Without context, life expectancy during the Middle Ages was not a sentence imposed at birth. It was a landscape filled with early traps, narrow paths, and occasional long clearing, and people moved through it with awareness rather than expectation, adapting continuously until adaptation failed and only then becoming part of the count. This is why the story does not end with a number, because numbers arrive after life has already happened, and medieval life happened unevenly, shaped by forces that removed some early, allowed others to continue, and left behind a statistical shadow that still confuses us now as we look back and try to compress lived endurance into a single measure that was never designed to hold it. And when we follow that shadow forward, instead of flattening it backward, another pattern becomes visible. A pattern that explains why medieval life expectancy cannot be reduced to a single era-wide verdict, because the Middle Ages themselves were never uniform, not across centuries, not across regions, not across living conditions. Life expectancy in the early medieval period did not mirror that of the later centuries, because population density shifted, trade networks expanded or collapsed, climate stability changed, and disease exposure moved with them. These changes altered survival quietly, without ever announcing themselves clearly to the people living through them. In quieter rural regions, isolation reduced exposure to epidemic disease, but increased vulnerability to famine, injury, and seasonal failure. Expanding towns, by contrast, created opportunity and steadier food flow, alongside crowding, waste, and constant contagion. Records that survive from monasteries, towns, and estates reflect these differences subtly through age, distributions that appear not as neat curves, but as irregular clusters shaped by local conditions rather than universal rules. And this irregularity is precisely what averages erase. Why does this matter? Because it shows that medieval life expectancy was responsive. It rose and fell with conditions, not centuries, and this responsiveness undermines the idea of a single medieval lifespan. Even within the same generation, survival could change dramatically after a good harvest, after a bad winter, after a local outbreak. These fluctuations shaped how long people lived far more than the calendar itself. They moved through danger that sometimes receded and sometimes returned. Life expectancy tracked these movements imperfectly, always late, always after the fact. This is why asking what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages requires resisting the comfort of summary, because summary belongs to hindsight. While survival did not know the average, they knew the risks. They knew which children had survived, which winters had been harsh, which neighbors had disappeared, and which elders were still present. That knowledge guided behavior far more accurately than any number ever could. In that sense, life expectancy existed as lived awareness rather than statistical fact. It was felt, not calculated, and it changed as conditions changed. Understanding this closes the distance between modern and medieval experience by showing that the difference lies not in how people valued life, but in how predictable survival had become. When predictability increased, averages rose, but at no point did the human capacity for endurance change, so the medieval lifespan cannot be captured by a single figure because it was never experienced as one. It unfolded unevenly, shaped by place, timing, and exposure, and only later condensed into a number that now stands in for a complexity it was never meant to hold. And once that complexity is acknowledged, the question naturally shifts from how long medieval people lived to how life was structured around the expectation that survival was uncertain and temporary, which shaped decisions, relationships, and priorities in ways that modern average cannot capture, because when survival is not guaranteed, planning becomes flexible, cautious, and immediate and abstract MIDI households were built around continuity rather than longevity. Families expected loss, but they also expected replacement, not in a careless sense, but as a practical response to high early mortality. Children were born frequently because survival demanded redundancy, not optimism, and this reproductive pattern alone tells us that life expectancy was experienced as something fragile early and negotiable later rather than fixed from birth. This fragility influenced how childhood was treated, not as a sheltered phase to be prolonged, but as a transition to usefulness. Children worked early not because parents were indifferent, but because contribution increased survival odds, both for the child and for the household as a whole. And this early integration into labor altered risk exposure, while also accelerating physical conditioning, which again complicates how life expectancy should be understood. Why does this matter? Because it shows that medieval life expectancy was shaped by social design as much as biology. Households adapted to risk by distributing labor, by maintaining close interdependence. Survival was communal, not individual, and this communal structure softened some dangers while amplifying others. When illness struck, it rarely affected one person in isolation. It moved through households and neighborhoods, removing some and sparing others. And this selective remover reinforced the sense that survival was endangered as a recurring feature rather than an exception. Religion provided a framework for interpreting this uncertainty, but it did not eliminate the practical realities of risk. Prayers did not replace preparation, rituals did not prevent famine, and faith coexisted with constant adjustment to environmental conditions, which again Gastent medieval people did not misunderstand their world. They simply lacked control over many of its variables. Life expectancy therefore functioned less as a horizon and more as a background pressure, shaping behavior subtly but persistently. People invested in skills rather than futures, in relationships rather than timings, rather than distant planning. And this orientation allowed survival to feel meaningful even when duration was uncertain. This perspective also explains why medieval records often focused less on age and more on role, land ownership, service obligations, marital status. These markers mattered because they indicated stability, because they predicted lifespan. Age alone said little about survival potential without context. In this way, life expectancy was embedded in social position rather than chronological progression. A person with land support and reduced physical strain could expect longer survival than one without, regardless of age, and this stratification shaped demographic outcomes. But consistently, the effects of disease outbreaks further illustrate this point. Plagues did not simply shorten lives, they redistributed survival, abruptly removing individuals across age groups, but disproportionately affecting those already weakened by prior conditions. After each outbreak, the remaining population often experienced improved resource and redistribution, created uneven life expectancy patterns that resist simplification. Mortality spikes lowered, averages dramatically, while post-crisis to live longer than before, and this oscillation defines medieval demographic history far more accurately than any stable figure. Why then do modern audiences struggle with this complexity and predictive? It suggests how long one might expect to live. Medieval life expectancy did neither. It described population outcomes, not individual features, and this mismatch creates misunderstanding. When modern frameworks are applied backward, understanding medieval life expectancy that a number should describe a life. Instead, it must be read as a measure of environmental hostility and structural inequality. And when read that way, it becomes informative rather than misleading. This shift also clarifies why medieval people did not perceive themselves as short-lived. They measured life in survivals, not years. Each avoided famine, each recovered illness, each endured winter, counted as success, and this accumulation of survivals produced long lives for some, even as many were removed early. The coexistence of early death and long survival is not a contradiction. It is the defining feature of medieval demography, and it explains why elders appear in records alongside high infant mortality without implying inconsistence. Life existence, but lived experience preserved it clearly. Communities remembered who had survived what, and this memory shaped expectations, behavior, and respect more powerfully than any abstract measure. When we look at medieval life through this lens, the familiar claim that people lived only to 30 dissolves into a misunderstanding rooted in statistical shorthand rather than historical reality. It describes early loss, not biological limitation. This distinction matters because it restores agency and endurance to past lives without romanticizing their hardship. Medieval people were not naive victims of short lifespans. They were skilled navigators of unstable environments, so when life expectancy is discussed, it should be framed as an outcome of risk distribution rather than a verdict on human potential. And once framed this way, it aligns medieval experience more closely with modern crises, where life expectancy shifts rapidly in response to war, famine, or disease, without implying sudden changes in human capacity. In this sense, medieval life expectancy offers a lesson rather than a curiosity. It shows how deeply survival depends on environment and how quickly averages respond to structural change. When conditions improved, survival expanded. When conditions deteriorated, it contracted, and throughout these shifts, human endurance remained remarkably constant. This continuity and social support in shaping how long lives are allowed to unfold, understanding what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, therefore, means understanding that lives were not uniformly short, they were unevenly distributed across risk, and once that unevenness is acknowledged, the past appears less alien and more instructive. The medieval world tested people early, repeatedly removing many before adulthood, while allowing others to persist long enough to age, accumulate experience, and contribute meaningfully. And this dual outcome defines the reality behind. The number life expectancy in that world was not destiny, it was probability shaped by exposure, timing, and circumstance, and individuals moved through it without knowing the average, only the next challenge. This is why the question continues to matter, because it reveals how easily numbers replace nuance and how quickly complexity is lost when survival is summarized rather than examined. And as long as the story is told through a single figure, it will remain incomplete while the lived reality continues to unfold quietly beneath it, waiting to be understood rather than counted. And once that lived reality is kept in view, the final misunderstanding around medieval life expectancy becomes easier to dismantle, because the number itself was never meant to describe experience. It was meant to summarize outcome, and outcome always lags behind. Because medieval people did not move through their lives thinking in terms of averages, they responded to signals: scarcity, illness, recovery, loss, survival, and these signals changed faster than any long-term expectation could form. This is why life expectancy felt fluid rather than fixed, and why planning remained short horizon. Not because people lacked foresight, but because foresight without control offered little advantage. A household planned for the next season, not the next decade, because conditions beyond that were unknowable, and this uncertainty shaped emotional investment decisions around labor, marriage, reproduction, and care. People bonded deeply but cautiously, they committed but remained adaptable, and this adaptability is what allowed communities to persist. Despite constant attrition, the presence of elders alongside frequent funerals was not contradictory. It was expected. Loss and continuity coexisted, and neither erased the other. Life expectancy, as we calculate it today, collapses this coexistence into a single value, which make medieval life appear uniformly brief when in reality it was sharply divided. Early danger by conditional endurance. The mistake is not in the data but in the interpretation. Because when early mortality dominates averages, the remaining lives disappear into the margin, and yet those remaining lives were where medieval society actually functioned. Knowledge was passed, land was managed, children were raised, and memory accumulated. This functioning core is invincible to the lived world. And once that is understood, the question, what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, can finally be answered. Honestly, it was harsh at the beginning, unstable throughout, and open-ended for those who endured long enough to reach it. And that answer does not comfort, but it clarifies. It replaces the myth of short lives with the reality of uneven survival, and shows that medieval people did not live less fully. They lived under conditions that decided early who would be allowed to continue and who would not. And after that sequence is understood, another dimension of medieval life expectancy becomes visible, one that rarely appears in summaries because it refuses to sit neatly inside demographic tables, yet it shapes survival just as powerfully, and that dimension is shock, sudden disruption, events that arrive without warning and rearranged life expectancy instantly rather than gradually. Famine was one such shock, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a cascading failure where crops failed, food stores thinned, bodies weakened, and diseases that would otherwise have been survivable became lethal. Famine did not always kill directly, it lowered the threshold at which everything else became fatal, and this lowering spread unevenly across communities, removing the very young, the already sick, and the marginal first, while leaving behind those with slightly more reserve, which again altered life expectancy through selective pressure rather than uniform decline. War functions similarly, but through different mechanics, because medieval warfare rarely resembled constant battlefield slaughter. Instead, it disrupted agriculture, displaced populations, destroyed food supplies, and increased disease exposure. Soldiers were removed abruptly, but civilians often suffered delayed consequences: hunger, injury, infection, stress, that shortened life indirectly and unpredictably, which makes war difficult to isolate as a cause of death, while still placing it at the center of life expectancy shifts. Epidemic disease represents the most visible shock, because it left records and memory. Plagues cut across age groups and social roles, collapsing the usual pattern of early loss followed by conditional endurance. Yet even here survival was uneven. Some recovered, others did not, and those who did often lived long afterward, benefiting from reduced competition for resources and altered social structures, which paradoxically extended life for some after mass mortality events. This pattern appears repeatedly. Outbreaks lower population density, temporarily increase food access and labor value, and improve survival odds for those who remain. Life expectancy dips sharply and then rebounds, not because conditions became safe, but because the balance between population and resources shifted, and this oscillation further demonstrates why medieval life expectancy climate acted as a slower shock. Colder periods shortened growing seasons, increased hunger, and weakened immune systems, while warmer periods allowed population growth and improved survival temporarily. These shifts unfolded over decades rather than years, but their impact on life expectancy. People did not experience climate change as an abstract trend. They experienced it as repeated hard winters, failed harvests, or unexpected abundance, and survival tracked those experiences rather than any long-term average. Why is this important? Because it shows that medieval life expectancy was dynamic, responsive to shocks and recoveries, rather than fixed by era, and this dynamism explains why different historians report different numbers depending on which period, region, or datamine they emphasize, and why none of those numbers alone can describe lived reality. When shocks accumulated, life expectancy fell. When stability returned, it rose, and throughout these cycles, human behavior adapted, migration patterns changed, marriage ages shifted, work arrangements evolved, and these adaptations fed back into survival outcomes. Another often overlooked factor is mobility. Medieval people moved more than stereotypes suggest, fleeing famine, seeking work, following trade routes, or relocating after disasters. Mobility altered exposure patterns, sometimes increasing risk, sometimes reducing it. And those who could move often survived longer than those who could not, again introducing inequality into life. Expectancy that averages conceal. Institutional structures also mattered. Monasteries, guilds, and extended kin networks provided buffers against shock. Members of these structures had access to food, care, and shelter during crises, which extended survival while those outside faced unmitigated risk. And this institutional protection is another reason why life expectancy varied so widely. None of these factors operated in isolation. They layered, interacted, and compounded, creating survival pathways that diverged sharply early and continued to diverge across life stages. Which is why asking for a single medieval life expectancy figure is like asking for the average depth of a river when survival depends entirely on where one steps. Medieval people learned this intuitively. They adjusted behavior after shocks. They remembered which paths were dangerous, which seasons were lean, which places offered refuge, and this memory informed survival decisions far more effectively than any abstract expectation of lifespan. This experiential knowledge also shaped emotional responses to death. Loss was frequent, but not normalized in the sense of indifference. Grief was present, but it coexisted with pragmatism, because survival required continuing despite absence. And this coexistence of mourning and adaptation further illustrates that medieval life expectancy was lived as a process rather medieval life expectancy mection. The persistence of the myth of universally short medieval lives therefore says more about modern discomfort with complexity than about the past. Numbers offer closure. They feel decisive, but medieval life resists closure because it was shaped by contingent forces that changed too often to be summarized cleanly. Understanding this does not require abandoning statistics, but it does require reading them with restraint, recognizing that they describe outcomes after the fact rather than experiences as they unfolded. And when this restraint is applied, the question of medieval life expectancy becomes less about correcting a number and more about restoring context. Context that shows many lives ended early, many continued long, and most were shaped by cycles of risk, recovery, and adaptation. And this pattern, rather than any single figure, is what life expectancy was actually like during the Middle Ages. And once that context is restored, another quiet misunderstanding dissolves, the idea that medieval people lived without awareness of time or death, when in reality they were acutely aware of both, simply in a different way. Because when life expectancy is unstable, awareness sharpens rather than fades. Time was not counted forward toward an assumed end. It was measured backward through survival, through winters endured, illnesses recovered from children, raised past danger, and this backward counting shaped how people understood age and longevity. A person was not considered old because of a number of years lived, but because of what they had survived, and this survival carried social meaning that modern age thresholds cannot frustrate. Elders were respected not for their age alone, but because their continued presence signaled an unusual alignment of circumstance, resilience, and support, and this respect reinforced the idea that long life was possible even if not guaranteed. This possibility mattered deeply because it countered fatalism. Medieval people did not assume early death as destiny. They treated survival as conditional but real, something that could be extended through care, cooperation, and adaptation. Households stored food when they could. Communities shared labor. Neighbors assisted during illness. Not because they believed everyone would live long, but because they believed some would. And that belief justified effort. This effort is often invisible in life expectancy figures, but it shaped outcomes continuously. Care did not stop death, but it delayed it often enough to matter, extending lives by months, years, sometimes decades, and these extensions accumulate quietly beneath the average. Even small delays mattered, because each delayed death allowed knowledge to pass, labor to continue, children to reach safer ages, and households to stabilize, which in turn improved survival odds for others. This feedback loop is essential to understanding medieval life expectancy. Survival was not only individual, it was systemic, and systems adapt, even when they cannot control all variables. When we see medieval life only through mortality rates, we miss this adaptive layer, the slow work of persistence that made society possible despite constant loss. The fact that medieval communities endured at all is evidence that life expectancy, while harsh at the beginning, allowed enough continuity to sustain culture, memory, and structure. This endurance contradicts the image of a society constant collapsing under premature death. Instead, it reveals a society constant repairing itself, adjusting to loss and redistributing roles. Life expectancy did not define this process, it emerged from it, and always after the fact. This is why medieval people could grieve deeply while continuing practically, because grief did not negate responsibility, and responsibility did not erase grief. Both coexisted as survival strategies. Understanding this coexistence is crucial, because it shows that medieval life expectancy was not experienced as a ceiling, but as a field of uncertainty in which effort still mattered. People acted as if survival could be extended, because often it could, and that belief shaped behavior even when outcomes were unpredictable. So when we ask again what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the answer is not only about danger, it is also about persistence under danger, about lives lived with the knowledge that continuation was uncertain, but still worth pursuing. And this pursuit is the thread that runs beneath every statistic, invisible but essential, reminding us that averages describe what happened, not how people lived while it was happening. And as that thread continues forward, the final pressure shaping medieval life expectancy emerges not from sudden shock, but from accumulation, the slow-wearing effect of repeated strain that did not kill immediately, but narrowed margins year after year, because survival in the medieval world was not decided once it was decided many times in small ways. Through diet that barely sustained, through labor that never fully rested, through injuries that healed imperfectly, and through infections that left weakness behind, even when they did not end life outright. And this accumulation explains why many medieval adults lived long lives that were physically diminished without being statistic short. Because life expectancy counts presence, not condition. It records that someone remained alive, not how much effort it took to remain that way, or how constrained that life became as the years passed. This matters because it reveals another distortion created by averages. The difference between living long and living intact. Medieval people often did the former without the latter, and this endurance under constraint shaped how aging was perceived, not as a decline from health, but as a gradual negotiation with limitation, which again reinforces that life expectancy cannot be read as quality or ease only, as duration. Survival, past early danger, did not mean safety. It meant a slower form of risk, where the body absorbed damage over time and adapted around it, and this adaptation produced lives that could extend into later decades, while carrying the weight of prior survival, which is why medieval elders often appear described through capability rather than age, who could still work, who could advise, who could supervise, who could no longer contribute physically but remain socially present. Age itself was secondary to function, and function was the true measure of survival, because function determined whether continued life was supported or withdrawn. In times of scarcity, households under strain made difficult choice. Resources were finite, care required labor, and when demands exceeded capacity, the weakest suffered first. And this harsh reality shaped life expectancy subtly by shortening lives at the margins without dramatic events that would register clearly in records. And this is another reason why medieval mortality appears abrupt in data, while being gradual in lived experience. People faded before they disappeared, they weakened before they died, and these transitions rarely mark themselves in statistics, yet they define the human cost behind them. Understanding this accumulation reframes the idea that medieval people were indifferent to longevity. They were acutely aware of its fragility precisely because they felt its erosion daily. They adjusted work pace, they relied more on younger kin, they shifted roles within the household, and these adjustments allowed life to continue, even as capacity declined, which again lengthens life lifespan without improving. Statistical, impestical, ethical, therefore remain conditional throughout life. A strong older adult with support could outlive a younger one, weakened by injury or illness. and this fluidity undermines any attempt to assign fixed age expectations because survival followed resilience and context rather than chronology. When modern readers imagine medieval life ending abruptly in early adulthood, they miss this extended phase of constrained endurance where life continued under limitation, and this phase occupied a large portion of medieval adulthood. If it does not dominate mortality curves, another layer shaping this endurance was knowledge, practical experience accumulated over years improved survival. Odds older individuals knew how to avoid certain risks, how to manage food, storage, how to respond to illness, and how to navigate social and this experiential advantage counterbalanced physical declaiture to some degree, which is why age could increase survival and probability in certain contexts rather than reduce it outright, and this inversion confuses modern expectations, but aligns with medieval realities where wisdom often mattered more than strength. Past a certain threshold, this also explains why medieval communities in memory and tradition, because memory preserves survival strategies across generations, allowing younger members to benefit from lessons learned through loss and endurance. And this transmission of knowledge extended life indirectly by preventing repeat mistakes and improving adaptation, which again lengthens survival in ways not immediately visible in averages. When life expectancy is viewed through this lens, it becomes clear that it functioned less as a measure of time and more as a record of how long systems of care, adaptation, and knowledge transmission remained effective around an individual. Once those systems failed, death followed regardless of age, and this dependency on systems rather than years is the core difference between medieval and modern longevity. Modern life expectancy assumes a baseline as a systemic support. Medieval life expectancy depended on whether that support could be maintained locally and continuously. This difference also explains why medieval life expectancy varied so dramatically between communities with similar climates, but different social structures. One could sustain elders, another could not. And the resulting divergence would appear as random variation in data, while being entirely predictable in live terms. When all these layers are combined, early mortality, shock, events, accumulation of strain, social support, and experiential adaptation, the picture of medieval life expectancy becomes clear. Not short, not simple, not uniform, but segmented, filtered, to be answered with precision rather than myth. What life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages depended on when survival began, how many filters were passed, how often conditions shifted, and how long support systems held. And for those who passed the earliest filters, life could extend far beyond the number most often quoted, but always under negotiation, always contingent, and never guaranteed. And this negotiation continued until the final moment, not as a countdown, but as a balance between resilience, resources, and circumstance, a balance that could hold for decades or collapse suddenly depending on forces that were felt daily but never predictable. And it is this lived negotiation, rather than any single figure, that defined medieval life expectancy, as it was experienced from within, not calculated afterward from without. And once the negotiated balance is understood, the final misconception around medieval life expectancy quietly falls away. The idea that people lived without any sense of future, when in reality they lived with a sharpened sense of conditional future. Because when survival is uncertain, attention moves closer, not farther. Medieval people did not imagine decades ahead, but they did imagine the next season, the next harvest, the next recovery, and these near futures were real, meaningful, and actionable, which is why effort persisted. Even when outcomes were unclear, expectation was short, but intention was not. And this distinction mattered because it shows that medieval life expectancy did not erase hope. It reshaped it. Hope was attached to survival milestones rather than distant and tied to a child reaching adolescence, to a winter passed without hunger, to an illness survived, and each milestone recalibrated the sense of how long life might continue, which recalibration happened repeatedly as lived experience expanded and contracted over time rather than remaining fixed. People felt their odds change, and responded accordingly, tightening behavior during danger, loosening it during stability. And this responsiveness is incompatible with the idea that medieval people accepted short lives as inevitable. Instead, they treated life as extendable under the right conditions. If those conditions were fragile, this mindset checked how they invested in care work, cooperation, and restraint, not because longevity was guaranteed, but because it was possible and possibility justified effort, even when probability was unclear. This perspective also explains why medieval narratives often focus on endurance rather than duration, rather than how long someone lived, because endurance signaled alignment with forces that mattered: weather, health, community, and timing, and these forces defined survival more accurately than age ever could. So when we look back and compress these lives into a single average, we lose the internal logic that guided behavior and replace it with a conclusion. Medieval people never experienced life expectancy was not something they knew, it was something that emerged from their actions after the fact, and this gap between life logic and retrospective measurement is the source of most modern misunderstanding about medieval longevity. Once that gap is acknowledged, the question what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages becomes less about correcting a statistic and more about restoring perspective. It was harsh, early conditional throughout, and negotiable until the end, shaped by environment, social structure, and accumulated strain, rather than by biological limits. And this understanding does not romanticize the past. It clarifies it by showing that medieval people lived under pressure, but not without agency, under uncertainty, but not without adaptation, and under risk, but not without continuity. And that continuity is the quiet evidence that life expectancy, while brutal at the beginning, allowed enough persistence for lives to unfold meaningfully beyond the number that now stands in for them. And once those daily calculations are taken seriously, the shape of medieval life expectancy becomes clearer, because survival was not extended by luck alone, but by repetition, the repeated choice to conserve, to wait, to endure, rather than to extract everything immediately. That repetition mattered, because medieval environments punished excess more reliably than restraint. A household that consumed too much in a good year shortened its chances in a bad one, while a household that accepted limitation during abundance could persist longer when scarcity arrived. This pattern explains why moderation was not simply moralized, but practiced as a survival skill. Moderation shortened life expectancy more efficiently. Hunger that came slowly could be adapted to hunger that arrived suddenly, killed. Medieval people learned this distinction through experience rather than theory, which reveals how life expectancy was shaped by behavioral memory rather than abstract planning. Social memory reinforced this learning. Community remembered famines long after they passed. They marked them in stories, customs, and cautionary practices, and these memories adjusted behavior for generations, smoothing risk curves enough to extend survival incrementally without eliminating danger. This smoothing effect is invisible in mortality tables, but crucial to understanding why some communities endured longer. Dwellings, bonuses, insulation, protection from damp, and proximity to animals, not for comfort, but for warmth. Warmth mattered because cold weakened bodies, and weakened bodies died more easily. Small architectural choices reduced exposure across a lifetime. The same logic applied to clothing. Layers were reused, repaired, and adapted to season rather than replaced, because continuity mattered more than novelty. That continuity stabilized bodies against sudden exposure, that shortened lives unpredictably. Risk awareness extended into movement. Travel was timed, routes were chosen carefully, and journeys were delayed or cancelled when conditions shifted. This cautious mobility pattern limited opportunity but preserved survival, and it highlights again that medieval life expectancy favored persistence. Overexpansion, communal labor further redistributed risk, harvests were shared, fields were worked collectively, and when illness, buffering extended to cover. By preventing single points, yet it also meant that endurance depended on social inclusion. Those outside communal networks faced shorter lives, not because they were weaker, but because they lacked protection, and this inequality is another reason why life expectancy varied so widely within the same population. Caregiving followed similar lines. Elders, children, and the sick were supported when resources allowed and abandoned when they did not out of cruelty, but because survival choices were constrained. That constraint shaped life expectancy by determining whose lives could be extended when margins narrowed and whose could not. These decisions were rarely recorded, but they structured outcomes profoundly. Remedies were tested, remembered, and modified, and while many failed, some reduced harm enough to matter, especially when combined with rest, warmth, and nutrition. This incremental effectiveness delayed death repeatedly without transforming survival into certainty, and it helps explain why medieval life expectancy is paradoxical. Many died young, and the system that produced both outcomes was the same. Adaptability extended life without guaranteeing it. Seasonal awareness also shaped reproduction. Conceptions clustered around periods of relative stability because pregnancy begun during famine or extreme labor, short survival for both mother and child. Family spacing adjusted when conditions worsened and tightened when conditions improved, which shows that medieval people responded dynamically to survival signals rather than passively accepting fate. The accumulation of these adjustments produced a demographic rhythm characterized by contraction during crisis. Life expectancy moved with this rhythm, not smoothly, but in steps, sudden drops, followed by gradual recoveries. This stepping pattern is flattened into a single number when averaged across centuries, yet it defines lived experience far more accurately. Emotional regulation played a role as well. Despair increased risk by encouraging withdrawal, recklessness, or neglect, while hope grounded in immediate achievable goals sustained effort. Membier culture emphasized endurance, patience, and acceptance, not as resignation, but as strategy. By Stietelen's Epavia. Rituals, storytelling, and communal gatherings reinforced it by normalizing uncertainty and providing shared frameworks for loss, which reduced social breakdown and preserved cooperation. And cooperation extended life more reliably than individual resilience alone. The interaction between emotion, behavior, and environment becomes another layer, shaping life expectancy beneath the surface of statistics, and it helps explain why medieval societies persisted despite relentless attrition. They did not eliminate risk, they organized around it. That organization allowed enough continuity for lives to stretch beyond the early danger zone into years that the average cannot reflect, because the average is dominated by those who never reach that zone. Once this organizing principle is understood, the claim that medieval people live short lives appears incomplete. It describes the cost of early filters, but ignores the endurance of those who passed them. Life expectancy, therefore, should be read as a measure of environmental hostility and social buffering rather than of human limitation. When read this way, it aligns medieval experience with modern situations where life expectancy collapses during war, famine, or epidemic without implying sudden biological regression. And when followed step by step, it reveals a logic of survival that is harsh but coherent, demanding but effective enough to allow lives to continue far beyond what a single number suggests. This coherence prepares the ground for the next layer of understanding, where perception, belief, and expectation shaped how medieval people interpreted aging itself, not as a countdown, but as evidence of accumulated survival. And that interpretive shift further explains why life expectancy functioned differently in medieval minds than it does in ours. Because what mattered was not how long one might live, but how much one had already endured, and whether endurance could continue under the conditions now unfolding. And as that interpretive shift takes hold, the way medieval people understood aging itself begins to look fundamentally different from modern expectations, because age was not a forecast, it was evidence. evidence that certain dangers had already been survived, and that survival changed how the future was approached. An older person was not someone closer to an inevitable end, but someone who had already demonstrated alignment with the conditions that allowed continuation, and this alignment shaped both self-perception and social treatment. Age carried authority, not because it promised wisdom in the abstract, because it proved endurance under pressure, which made older individuals valuable sources of practical judgment in a world where theory offered little protection. This valuation fed back into survival because authority justified care and care extended life, which means age could sometimes increase safety rather than reduce it, depending on context. This feedback loop helps explain why medieval life expectancy does not decline smoothly with age, the way modern models assume. Instead, it fractures, becomes conditional, and sometimes even reverses in specific social settings where elders were protected and consulted rather than discarded. This does not mean aging was gentle. Decline was real, pain accumulated and capacity narrowed, but decline did not automatically remove social relevance, and relevance mattered because relevance kept one embedded in systems of support. When relevance was lost, survival shortened regardless of age, which again shows that life expectancy followed role and relationship more closely than chronology. This perspective also clarifies why medieval narratives rarely dwell on age. Numbers, birthdays mattered less than thresholds survived. The first winter, the first illness, the first harvest managed independently. These milestones redefined how long life felt because they marked transitions into safer zones rather than steps toward an end, and each transition recalibrated expectation quietly without announcing itself. This recalibration is invisible in records but central to experience. People did not wake up older and feel closer to death. They woke up having survived another cycle, and survival itself reshaped what seemed possible next. Which is why medieval life expectancy functioned as an emergent property rather than a fixed limit, and why it felt expandable even under constant risk until conditions shifted again and endurance was tested anew under circumstances that could either sustain it or finally overwhelm it, without regard for how many years had already been endured. And from that point, the understanding of medieval life expectancy deepens further when we look at how death itself was anticipated, not as a date, but as a condition that could arrive when balance finally failed. Medieval people lived with a constant awareness that survival depended on alignment between body, environment, and community, and when that alignment broke, death followed, regardless of age. This awareness did not create obsession, it created attentiveness. People watched signs closely, weakness that lingered, coughs that did not pass, changes in appetite, reduced capacity to work. Because these signals mattered more than the number of years already lived, attention shaped behavior long before the end arrived. Effort slowed, care increased, thoughts shifted. These transitions were gradual enough that death often appeared as the final step in a long visible process rather than a sudden interruption. This gradualness complicates how life expectancy should be understood, because it means many medieval deaths were preceded by extended periods of decline that do not register as shortened life in statistics, yet define lived time intensely. The final years mattered socially, even when they added little to the numerical span. Elders who weakened were still present, still counted, still remembered, and their presence shaped households long after physical productivity declined. This reinforces the idea that life expectancy measured presence, not capacity, and presence carried meaning, independent of strength. When death finally came, it was often expected, prepared for, and integrated into routine, rather than resisted as an anomaly. Preparation took many forms. Property was redistributed, responsabilities were reassigned, knowledge was passed deliberately. These acts extended the influence of a life beyond its biological end. A person's life did not stop contributing when the body failed. Contribution shifted form, and this shift softened the boundary between living and dying. The expectation of death as a process rather than a moment also shaped emotional response. Fear existed, but it was tempered by familiarity. Loss was painful, but it was not incomprehensible. This familiarity reduced panic and reduced panic stabilized behavior, which indirectly preserved survival for those remaining. In this way, even death fed back into life expectancy by shaping how communities responded to absence without collapsing. The calm integration of death into social rhythm prevented secondary losses. Again, these effects do not appear in mortality curves, but they alter outcomes repeatedly across generations. The medieval relationship to death, therefore, cannot be separated from medieval life expectancy, because the way death was anticipated changed how life was managed up to that point. People did not race toward an unknown end. They adjusted pace continuously, watching for imbalance, correcting when possible, accepting when correction failed. This acceptance was not resignation, it was recognition of limits. Recognition allowed resources to be redirected efficiently, care to be focused where it mattered, and effort to be conserved rather than wasted. Wasted effort shortened lives, conserved effort extended them. This principle applied every scale, individual, household, community. When viewed this way, medieval life expectancy appears not as a single outcome, but as the trace left by thousands of small calibrations made under pressure. Each calibration mattered a little. Together they mattered enormously. The mistake of modern interpretation. A low average is treated as a verdict, when it is actually residue. It is what remains after early loss, repeated shock, and long endurance have been compressed into one value. Medieval people never encountered that value. They encountered only the process. They lived inside it. They learned its contours. They adapted to its shifts. And through that adaptation, many lives extended far beyond what the number implies. Not comfortably, not safely, but meaningfully, with continuity, with memory, and with a sense that survival, while uncertain, was negotiable until it was not. This negotiation, rather than any fixed span, is what life expectancy truly represented in the medieval world. And once that is understood, the familiar claim about short lives loses its power, because it no longer explains anything that the lived experience itself did not already reveal. And as that lived attentiveness continues, another layer clarifies how medieval life expectancy operated beneath awareness, because survival was constantly recalibrated through comparison rather than calculation. People compared this winter to the last one, this illness to the previous bout, this harvest to the memory of failure, and these comparisons mattered more than any abstract sense of years remaining. Comparison created reference points shaped restraint. Restraint extended life incrementally by preventing panic and excess. When a winter was milder than feared, effort relaxed slightly. When it was harsher, effort contracted early. This elasticity allowed households to avoid the sharp shocks that killed most efficiently. It also meant that life expectancy felt elastic, stretching and tightening with conditions rather than counting down toward an end. In this context, age became a record of adjustments survived. Each year lived represented, not time passed, but decisions made correctly often enough that interpretation changed, how risk was faced. People who had survived multiple cycles trusted caution more than optimism, and this trust altered behavior, subtly reducing exposure to hazards that statistics later interpreted as longevity. The role of memory deepened this effect. Memory was practical, not nostalgic. It catalogued mistakes. A path avoided, because someone had died there, shortened travel time, less than it extended survival. A tool modified after an injury reduced productivity less than it prevented the next accident. These micro-adjustments did not appear dramatic, but their accumulation mattered. Over decades, they bent life trajectory outward, not by eliminating risk. This bending explains why medieval life expectancy curves are jagged rather than smooth, with clusters of survival appearing where behavior aligned with conditions, and collapses where alignment failed. The social circulation of memory amplified this effect. Stories were repeated until they functioned as rules, customs, a code caution. Even superstition sometimes served survival by enforcing delay or restraint where knowledge was thin. The effectiveness of these practices did not depend on accuracy but on behavioral outcome. If a belief delayed travel during dangerous weather, it reduced exposure, regardless of its cause. Thus, belief systems interacted with life expectancy through action, not truth. Another stabilizing factor was redundancy of roles. Knowledge was shared, set overlapped. When one person weakened, another could substitute. This redundancy reduced catastrophic failure, shortened lives abruptly. Redundancy slowed failure into manageable decline. Again, the difference appears small per event, but luckily, foods that could be relied upon reduced uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty preserved energy. Preserved energy delayed breakdown. None of this guaranteed long life, but it made long life possible often enough to matter. The same logic shaped conflict avoidance. Feuds were costly, violence invited retaliation. Many disputes were settled through compensation or mediation. Not because justice was gentle, but because survival was practical. A broken arm could end a working life, a feud could fracture protection networks. Restraint preserved capacity. Capacity preserved life. When violence did occur, it often shortened lives quickly, which is why its avoidance mattered disproportionate to life. Mobility, choice, reinforced the same calculus. Migration occurred, but selectively people moved when remaining was riskier than leaving, not when opportunity alone beckoned. This conservative limited growth. But preserved survivance was locally higher due to accumulated alignment between people and place. The slow accumulation of strain remained the counterweight. Bodies wore down, injuries compounded, illnesses left marks, survival extended, but at cost. This cost shaped perception. Longevity did not promise comfort. It promised continued negotiation with limitation. That negotiation influenced when people relinquished roles, when they sought care, when they prepared for death. Disruption shortened lives beyond the deceased. Thus, preparation indirectly preserved life expectancy by preventing secondary losses. The final years, often marked by diminished capacity, still contributed to social continuity through instruction, arbitration, and memory contribute justifitative. Kerminofit demos. This cursor effect is the quiet engine beneath medieval demography. It explains how societies persisted under attrition without requiring extraordinary resilience. Ordinary restraint, repeated correctly, was enough. From this vantage, medieval life expectancy appears as a pattern of negotiated survival, rather than a verdict, and that conditionality shaped behavior so deeply that survival outcomes became the residue of choices made under pressure rather than the expression of biological limits. Understanding this residue requires following the process forward, not compressing it backward. When followed forward, the process reveals coherence. Harshness did not preclude order, uncertainty did not eliminate agency and endurance. While costly, accumulated into lives that extended beyond the early danger zone, often enough to sustain culture, memory, and structure across generations. This coherence does not soften the past, it clarifies it. It shows why a single number misleads and why medieval people experienced their lives as negotiable, adjustable, and meaningful even when outcomes were never promised, because promise was never the currency that mattered. Alien was, repetition was, and repetition practiced with restraint carried life forward until alignment failed, not because time ran out, but because conditions finally diverged. And with that recognition in place, the third phase can finally close, because the inner logic that governed medieval life expectancy has been fully traced from daily calculation through accumulated adjustment to negotiated endings. What remains is not a number, but a method, a way of living that treated survival as responsive rather than predetermined. Medieval people did not live under the shadow of a fixed lifespan. They lived within a field of changing conditions, where attention, restraint, and social buffering could extend life incrementally. Without ever guaranteeing it, this field shaped expectations. People expected duration throughout. They were calibrated by experience, and they guided behavior more accurately than averages ever could. Life expectancy, as later calculated, captured the cost of early loss, but not the persistence that followed. It recorded who fell out of the system, not how the system worked for those who remained. This mismatch between record and reality is the source of enduring misunderstanding. Once corrected, the medieval world looks less like a place of uniformly short lives and more like a place of uneven survival governed by practical intelligence. Under constraint, that intelligence did not remove suffering, it organized it. It reduced secondary collapse. It preserved continuity long enough for lives to unfold beyond childhood and early adulthood for many, even as many others were removed early. The coexistence of these outcomes is not contradictory, it is the defining feature of medieval demography. Understanding this feature closes the gap between lived experience and retrospective measurement. It explains why medieval people invested in care, cooperation, and caution despite uncertainty. It explains why elders existed alongside frequent funerals. It explains why age was respected as evidence of survived danger rather than counted years. And it explains why life expectancy functioned as an emergent property of behavior and environment. With this understanding, the question of what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages has been answered as fully as it can be without distortion. It was harsh at the beginning, conditional throughout, and negotiable until the end. It was shaped by repeated decisions, social memory, and adaptive restraint. It allowed endurance without comfort, continuity without certainty, and meaning without promise. This conclusion does not summarize with a number, it restores a process. And restoring that process completes the third phase of the story, leaving the ground prepared to contrast this lived, backward-looking logic of survival with the modern, forward-projecting logic of expectancy that follows. And with the third phase complete, the fourth begins by quietly turning the lens toward the present, not abruptly, not through contrast headlines, but by exposing a tension that modern listeners already feel without naming it. Because the way we understand life expectancy today is fundamentally opposite to the way it was lived in the medieval world, and that reversal is not neutral. It changes how people think, feel, and behave in ways that are rarely examined. Modern life expectancy points forward. It projects a future. It suggests a personal horizon, a rough outline of how long one might live, and this projection shapes identity, planning, anxiety, and hope in advance. Medieval life expectancy, by contrast, operated backward. It emerged, alone rewires the emotional experience of living. When life is projected forward, it creates expectation. Expectation creates attachment. Attachment creates fear of deviation, because anything that threatens the projected span feels like theft rather than uncertainty. This emotional structure changes how people respond to risk, suffering, and loss. In the modern world, danger is framed as interruption, something that should not happen, yet still does. This contradiction produces stress because systems promise continuity while reality occasionally withdraws it. Medieval systems never promised continuity. They offered negotiation. Because of that, loss did not contradict expectation, it confirmed it, which paradoxically reduced shock, even as suffering remained intense. This does not mean medieval people suffered less. It means they suffered without betrayal by a forecast. That distinction matters, because betrayal amplifies distress in ways raw hardship does not. When modern people hear medieval life expectancy figures, they often interpret them as evidence of ignorance or fatalism. The opposite may be closer to the truth, and that absence of projection changed how uncertainty was metabolized. Life was managed in the present, not measured against a promised future. This orientation created a kind of psychological elasticity that modern systems often lack. Today, life expectancy, statistics shape policy, insurance, retirement, identity, and self-worth. They become benchmarks against which individuals compare themselves. This comparison introduces pressure that medieval people never experienced because survival was not framed as underperforming a number. You either continued or you did not. Continuation carried its own meaning without reference to an abstract average. This difference alters how aging is felt. Modern aging felt like accumulating proof. Proof changed how one was treated, how one was supported, and how one evaluated risk. This inversion also affects how death is perceived in modern contexts. Death before the projected span feels premature, regardless of circumstance. In medieval contexts, death was judged by preparation, alignment, and continuity. A death could be timely or untimely based on whether obligations were settled, knowledge transmitted, and dependence secured, not on whether a numerical threshold had been crossed. This framework softened disruption even when grief remained, because it anchored meaning in process rather than duration. Modern listeners sense this difference intuitively, which is why medieval life both repels and fascinates. It appears brutal but coherent, harsh but ordered. That coherence draws attention because modern life often feels safer, yet psychologically more fragile, precisely because expectations are higher and less flexible. When modern systems fail, they fail against a backdrop of promise, and that failure feels catastrophic. Medieval failures occurred against a backdrop of contingency and were absorbed into adaptation rather than rupture. This does not romanticize the past, it exposes a trade-off. Safety increases projection, projection increases von morph. Medieval people inhabited time locally, seasonally, and retrospectively. Modern people inhabit time globally, linearly, and prospectively. Each mode carries costs. Medieval endurance required constant adjustment. Modern projection requires constant reassurance. When reassurance falters, anxiety rises even in the absence of immediate danger. They challenge the assumption that longer projected life necessarily produces greater peace. That assumption may not hold once examined closely. Medieval life expectation, constrained possibility. But stabilized expectation expands possibility. But destabilizes expectation. That attachment changes how people experience illness, aging, and loss, even when material conditions are vastly improved. The question then is not which system was better, but what each reveals about the human relationship to uncertainty. Medieval systems normalize uncertainty and built social mechanisms to manage it. Modern systems minimize uncertainty statistically, while amplifying it psychologically, because deviation from projection becomes threatening. This tension sets the stage for the next phase, where medieval and modern logics of expectancy collide, not in data, but in lived experience, revealing why the story of medieval life expectancy continues to resonate, not because of how short lives were, but because of how differently life itself was understood, when time was something survived rather than promised. And once that collision is felt, a quieter unease settles in, because it exposes something modern listeners rarely question. If life expectancy no longer simply describes survival, but actively shapes expectation, then what happens when that expectation becomes fragile? What happens when the projected future feels less certain than promised? This is where the medieval perspective begins to feel unexpectedly relevant, not as a model to copy, but as a mirror that reflects our discomfort. Medieval people lived without the reassurance of projection, yet they developed tolerance for uncertainty through repetition and adaptation. Modern people live with projection everywhere, yet struggle when reality deviates even slightly from the forecast. This contrast does not suggest regression, it suggests imbalance. When expectation outpaces resilience, anxiety fills the gap. Longer life, when framed as entitlement rather than contingency, becomes a source of fear rather than comfort. Illness feels like violation. Aging feels like failure. Death feels like interruption instead of conclusion. Medieval life expectancy never carried that burden. It did not promise. It did not guarantee. It invited attention. it did not guarantee. Attention to what could be done now, rather than what should happen later. And this difference explains why the medieval world, despite its danger, produced a kind of psychological steadiness that modern systems often lack. Not because life was easier, but because expectation was lighter. Survival was uncertain, but it was honest. And honesty, even under pressure, stabilizes the mind in ways reassurance sometimes cannot. And from that psychological steadiness, another layer becomes visible, because when expectation is lightened, behavior changes subtly but decisively. And this difference explains why medieval societies, despite constant exposure to loss, were able to sustain continuity across generations. When people do not live under the pressure of a projected lifespan, effort is invested in practices that reduce variance, not maximo outcome. Fields are planted conservatively. Stores are rationed with memory of previous failures in mind. Social ties are maintained even when inefficient. Because redundancy contracts survival, this orientation contrasts sharply with modern system. Medieval life expectancy did not encourage acceleration, it encouraged pacing, and pacing altered how risk accumulated over time. A slower rhythm reduced catastrophic failure, even if it limited peak prosperity. This rhythm shaped labor patterns, family organizations bed in ways that are often misread. The absence of forward projection also altered how responsibility was distributed. Without a promised future span, responsibility focused on immediate contribution rather than deferred payoff. Children were valued for participation as much as potential. Elders were valued for guidance as much as productivity. This distribution kept knowledge circulating horizontally rather than waiting for generational turnover, and that circulation reduced vulnerability when sudden loss occurred. Modern systems often defer knowledge transmission, assuming tamtimuri as owe it. They treated seniority as urgent. This urgency shaped learning, apprenticeship, and memory, embedding survival skills deeply in chip. Life expectancy statistics cannot capture this urgency, yet it directly influenced how long communities endured. The modern reversal of expectancy logic shifts urgency elsewhere. Planning replaces adaptation. Insurance replaces attentiveness. These tools increase security statistically, but they also externalize responsive statistics. When systems fail, individuals feel exposed because the protective mechanisms they trusted operate at a distance. Medieval protection operated nearby, in faces known and routine shared, that proximity softened fear, even when danger remained. This difference helps explain why modern listeners often feel a vague longing when encountering medieval life. The longing is not for hardship, but for coherence, for a system where survival logic was visible, understandable, and shared. Life expectancy in the medieval world was not hidden in data. It was enacted in choices, habits, and limits recognized collectively. Everyone knew why certain behaviors matters. Everyone had seen the consequences of excess or neglect. This shared understanding created alignment between belief and experience that modern systems struggle to maintain. Today, people are told they should live long lives, yet they witness unpredictable loss regularly through news, illness, and accident. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance. Many people were told nothing. They witnessed unpredictability directly and their expectations. This does not imply peace. It implies coherence, and coherence stabilizes behavior under stress. When examining life expectancy through this lens, the medieval world appears less irrational than often assumed. Its logic was harsh, but internally consistent. Modern logic is generous, but often internally conflicted. Generosity promises more. When those promises strain, anxiety fills the gap. This anxiety feeds constant monitoring of health, productivity, and time, turning life into a project that must be managed successfully to justify its length. Medieval life was not justified by length, it was justified by participation. This value orientation altered how people evaluated them. Failure was contextual. Success was situational. Identity was flexible. Modern identity, tied to projected lifespan and achievement across it, is more brittle. Deviation feels personal. Illness feels like falling behind. Aging feels like decline rather than accumulation. That extending life numerically does not automatically deepen life experientially. Meaning emerges from alignment between expectation and reality, not from duration alone. Medieval life expectancy aligned with love condition. Modern life expectancy often floats above them, abstracted and average. When reality diverges, distress follows. The insight does not argue for abandoning Prost. Prost demands reassurance. Reassurance requires control. Control is never absolute. When control falters, fear rises. Medieval systems did not rely on control. They relied on responsiveness. This responsiveness trained attention, patience, and restraint. These traits extended survival incrementally. Not by eliminating danger. The cumulative effect allowed many lives to stretch well beyond early filters, even if many never reached that point. Life expectancy statistics collapse this pattern into a single figure, obscuring the lived logic beneath. By restoring that logic, we begin to see medieval life expectancy not as a measure of how little people lived, but of how they lived within limits that were acknowledged rather than denied. This reframing does not diminish modern achievement, it contextualizes it. It reminds us that the human capacity to endure has remained stable, while the structures surrounding it have shifted. Medieval endurance was trained through exposure. Modern endurance is tested by expectation. Both impose strain, but they strain differently. Understanding this prepares the ground for the next layer of analysis, where the biological realities of aging intersect with cultural interpretation, revealing how the body itself became a different kind of evidence in medieval and modern worlds, and how that difference further shaped what life expectancy meant beyond the number that survives in memory. And when that intersection between body and interpretation is examined more closely, another quiet shift appears, because medieval people did not read the body as a gaudo device, but as a record of endurance. Each scar, each limitation, each survival past a known danger was interpreted not as decline, but as evidence that alignment had held. The body was not expected to remain stable, change was assumed. What mattered was whether change still allowed participation, as long as one could contribute, advise, remember, or labor in some form, life retained its place. This outlook altered how aging felt internally. Pain was not proof of failure. Fatigue was not a warning that time was running out. There were signals to adjust pace, redistribute effort, and rely more heavily on others. Modern bodies are read differently. Pain is medicalized immediately. Fatigue is framed as inefficiency. Limitation is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accommodated. This difference intensifies anxiety around aging because the body becomes a site of constant evaluation against an expected trajectory. Against function in the present, modern bodies are evaluated against projections of future capacity. That contrast reshapes emotional experience profoundly. In the medieval world, reaching advanced age was not associated with surpassing an average. It was associated with having navigated enough hazards to remain. Age carried authority, not because it represented years accumulate, but because it signaled tested surviving. Elders embodied proof that adaptation was possible. This reassurance mattered more than numbers ever could in modern contexts. Reassurance is outsourced to statistics. Charts replace elders. Projections replace memory. Yet statistics cannot model individual disruption, and projections cannot comfort. When reality diverges, medial reassurance was embodied. It stood nearby. The way illness was interpreted followed the same pattern. Medieval illness was contextualized within environment, season, labor, and diet. Recovery was uncertain, but uncertainty was expected. Illness did not immediately threaten identity. Modern illness often does, because it interrupts a projected narrative. People ask not only whether they will recover, but whether they will return to the life they planned. This framing multiplies distress. Mid-air framing narrowed it. The question was simpler: can one still endure? Can one still contribute? Can one still remain? These questions did not eliminate fear, but they contained it. When life expectancy is understood through these embodied lenses, the medieval world appears less defined by short lives. Lives were extended not by denying decline, but by integrating it. The body was allowed to change without invalidating the person. Modern systems struggle with this integration. Longevity has increased, but tolerance for bodily unpredictability has not increased at the same pace. This mismatch produces unease. People live longer, yet feel more threatened by signs of limitation. Medieval people lived shorter on average, yet felt less betrayed by change. This paradox unsettles modern listeners because it suggests that peace is not guaranteed by duration. Life expectancy, then, becomes a mirror reflecting not only mortality, but values. It shows what a society expects from time, from bodies, and from survival itself. Medieval expectancy accepted fragility and built around it. Modern expectancy resists fragility and attempts to smooth it statistically. Both approaches extend life in different ways. Both impose costs. Recognizing this does not require choosing one over the other. It requires understanding that numbers alone cannot tell the story. The medieval experience reminds us that living is not simply about reaching a projected endpoint. It is about remaining aligned with conditions as they unfold, adjusting without resentment, and finding meaning not in how long one might live, but in how coherently one continues while living. And as that mirror settles into place, the modern listener begins to notice a quiet discomfort because the medieval relationship to time exposes something unresolved in contemporary life. When time is projected forward as a promise, it becomes something to protect, to optimize, to defend. Each year gained increases the perceived value of the future, but also increases the perceived cost of losing it. This creates a subtle escalation of fear that grows alongside longevity. The longer one expects to live, the more catastrophic interruption. Feels medieval people did not experience this escalation in the same way because expectation did not accumulate. Survival was never banked. It was renewed each season lived, did not guarantee the next. This prevented the compounding of anxiety that modern systems quietly generate. Fear existed, but it did not compound across decades. It reset with conditions. This reset mechanism mattered more than comfort. It kept psychological load proportional to immediate risk. Modern life often reverses this relationship. Immediate risk may be low, yet imagined loss is vast, because the future is densely populated with plans, identities, and expectations. When illness or disruption appears, it threatens not only the present but the entire projected structure. Medieval disruption threatened the present alone. This difference explains why modern people can feel overwhelmed even in relative safety, while medieval people could function under constant threat. The load was distributed differently across time. Medieval endurance concentrated effort on now. Modern endurance stretches effort thin across imagined futures. Medieval vigilance was narrow and practical. Watch the weather, watch the body, watch the stores. Modern vigilance is abstract. Watch the numbers, watch the trends, watch the projections. Abstract vigilance exhausts without resolving. Practical completion matters for sleep, for rest, for psychological recovery. Medieval nights follow days of resolved effort. Modern nights follow days of unresolved anticipation. This difference alone alters how deeply people rest. Life expectancy as projection reaches into the nervous system. It trains the body to remain alert beyond necessity. Medieval expectancy did not train alertness, it trained responsiveness. Alertness without resolution accumulates tension. Responsiveness with resolution dissipates it. This distinction helps explain why modern longevity coexists with widespread fatigue. Despite unprecedented comfort, comfort does not neutralize expectation. It amplifies it. Vivid discomfort, limited expressed in. Modern limits are hidden behind systems. Modern limits are hidden behind system. When limits are here, they arrive suddenly. creating shock. Medieval limits are arrived gradually. Shock was less acute, even when loss was severe. This pattern shapes how grief unfolded. Medieval grief was intense, but it was embedded within continuity. Loss was expected to occur within a lifetime. Modern grief often feels anomalous. It disrupts a narrative that promised more time. This narrative disruption intensifies suffering. It implies it was contextualized. Conk absorbs force. Numbers do not. Life expectancy numbers strip context. They tell how many years were lived, but not how those years were held. Bed of life expectancy, when understood as lived structure rather than statistic, reveals a society organized around absorbing loss without collapsing meaning. It was distributed throughout participation. One did not need to reach old age to justify existence. One needed to contribute while able. This reduced the stakes of duration. Modern systems raise the stakes. Long life becomes the measure of success. Shortened life becomes failure, regardless of contribution. This framing pressures individuals to justify survival continuously. It also devalues lives that deviate from the expected arc. Medieval frameworks did not devalue deviation. Deviation was normal. Survival curves were irregular. Lives ended at many points, meaning adapted accordingly. This adaptability reduced comparison. Modern system, who age better, who what health. Comparison feeds anxiety. Anxiety shortens perceived time. Even as actual time increases, medieval people had little basis for comparison. Each life was local. Each outcome was personal. Without global averages, there was no universal standard to fall short of. This absence protected self-worth. Modern abundance of data erodes it against which bodies and choices are measured. Falling short feels personal, even when causes are structural or random. Medieval people understood random intimately. They did not internalize it as failure. Modern people often do, because projection implies control. When control fails, blame seeks a target. Often, that target is the selfies. This internalizing compromised, risk it, weather, disease. These were forces to negotiate, not reflections of personal inadequacy. This externalization preserved dignity under loss. Modern frameworks internalize risk management. Health becomes responsibility. Longevity becomes a urge. Shame can accompany grief. This is a heavy psychological cost attached to extended life. Expectancy, it is rarely acknowledged, because it hides beneath success narratives. Medieval life expectancy carried no success narrative, it carried a survival narrative. Survival narratives do not require perfection, they require persistence. Persistence tolerates imperfection. Less brittle, even when materially fragile. Modern societies are materially robust, yet psycho-big-truction. It argues for recalibrating expectation, for recognizing that living longer does not automatically mean living lighter, without aligning expectation to uncertainty. Added years can carry added weight. Life expectancy, then, is not merely about how long humans live, it is about how humans relate to time, risk, and meaning across that span. Medieval people related to time as something negotiated daily. Modern people relate to time as something promised conditionally. When promises strain, distress follows. When negotiation is constant, distress remains contained. This insight reframes the medieval past not as a failure to achieve longevity but as an alternative organization. An organization that accepted fragility openly, distributed meaning widely, and allowed life to be lived without the constant pressure of becoming what a number suggests one should be. And once this difference is fully absorbed, the medieval world begins to feel less distant, not because conditions were similar, but because the emotional mechanics of endurance remain recognizable. People still respond better to uncertainty when it is acknowledged rather than denied. They still adapt more effectively when expectations remain flexible. Medieval life expectancy, stripped of its numerical shorthand, demonstrates its truth with unusual clarity. It shows that endurance is not sustained by confidence in outcomes, but by confidence in process. They trusted repetition, adjustment, and collective memory more than prediction. This trust stabilized behavior under pressure. Modern systems trust prediction. When prediction fails, trust fractures, their contemporary anxiety often feels disproportionate to immediate danger. It is not the danger that overwhelms, it is the collapse of expectation. Medieval societies avoided this collapse by never inflating expectation beyond what experience could support. Survival was never abstract, it was always conditional. This conditionality shaped humility toward time. One did not assume continuity, one prepared for disruption. This preparation often aims to eliminate disruption. When elimination proves impossible, fear escalates. This escalade feeds cycles of control, monitoring, and self-surveillance that exhaust rather than protect. Medieval systems did not monitor the self continuously. They monitored conditions. This outward focus preserved many face. Expectancy, the lot about returning to risk, it is about recalibrating how expectation is carried. Longevity without psychological alignment can become a burden. Shorter lives when aligned with reality can feel coherent. The medieval experience suggests that meaning does not scale linearly with time, it scales with integration, ideation between body, environment, and community. When that integration holds, life feels inhabitable even under threats. Life expectancy figures, when treated as in Thai, obscure this integration. When treated as reflections of life structure, they reveal it. Medieval people did not misunderstand life. They understood its limits intimately. Modern misunderstanding arises not from ignorance, but from abstraction. Bridging this gap requires remembering that living is not a project to be completed, but a process to be maintained. Medieval life expectancy functioned as a byproduct of that maintenance. Modern life expectancy often attempts to define it. This inversion explains why medieval endurance continues to unsettle modern audiences. It reminds us that peace emerges when expectation, uncertainty, and effort remain in balance, and that balance, once lost, cannot be restored by adding years alone. And when that balance fails to hold, another consequence emerges quietly, because modern life expectancy not only shapes expectation, it reshapes attention. Attention shifts away from the present and toward preservation of a future self that may never fully arrive. People begin to live defensively rather than responsively. Choice their evaluation, not by their coherence with current conditions, but by how they might protect or enhance a projected lifespan. This orientation fragments experience. Moments are no longer complete in themselves, they are rehearsals for later, investments toward an end point. Medieval life did not fragment this way. Attention stayed anchored in the immediate web of survival, labor, relationship, and season. The future mattered, but only insofar as it emerged from what was done now. This anchoring reduced the sense of postponement that modern people often feel, the sense that real life has not yet begun because it is scheduled for later. Medieval people did not wait for life to start. Life was already underway, always conditional, always active. This immediacy altered how satisfaction was felt. Satisfaction was not deferred until goals were achieved. It was found in continuation itself. A winter survived was meaningful. A child reaching another year was meaningful. These milestones were modest, but they accumulated meaning steadily rather than concentrating it at the end of life. Modern systems often concentrate meaning in milestones tied to age or achievement. Retirement, longevity, legacy. When these milestones are threatened or delayed, meaning feels compromised. Medieval systems distributed meaning across time. This distribution functioned as psychological insurance long before formal insurance existed. It buffered against despair when outcomes deviated from hope. Life expectancy statistics obscure this distribution because they compress time into a single arc. They imply a smooth progression from birth to death, even when reality is jagged. Medieval reality was ovenly jagged. It did not pretend to smoothness. The honesty shaped resilience. People expected disruption. They did not interpret it as personal collapse. Modern people trained by smooth curves, often do this difference becomes especially visible during crisis. When war, famine, or epidemic strikes modern populations, life expectancy drops suddenly, and the shock is provoked. Medieval populations lived with this violation continuously. Expectation was never inflated to the point where collapse felt anomalous. This does not reduce tragedy. It alters interpretation determine, theory, integrated into shared narratives of endurance. Modern grief often isolates because it contradicts an implicit promise of safety and longevity. This isolation amplifies suffering. Another layer appears when considering how time itself was narrated. Medieval time was cyclical. Seasons returned, risks returned, loss returned. Continuity was maintained through repetition, not progress. Modern time is linear. Progress is expected. Setbacks feel backward. This temporal structure interacts with life. Expectancy growth dully. Linear time encourages accumulation. Life expectancy as a linear projection fits modern time. Life expectancy as a backward-looking summary fits medieval time. When these logics are confused, misunderstanding arises. Modern audiences judge medieval life by linear standards. It never operated under. They see short averages and infer failure. This mismatch fueled the persistent myth that medieval lives were uniformly short and miserable. In truth, they were uneven, demanding and structured around survival logic that made sense within its temporal frame. Understanding this frame dissolves the shock value of low averages and replaces it with a more complex picture of endurance under constraint. Modern fascination with medieval life expectancy often carries an unspoken question. How did people endure without the guarantees we rely on? The answer is uncomfortable. They endured because they did not rely on guarantees. Reliance creates vulnerability when guarantees fail. Medieval endurance relied on responsiveness, redundancy, and acceptance of limits. Modern systems reduce dependence on immediate outcomes by promising long-term security. When that promise weakens, vulnerability increases dramatically. This dynamic explains why modern societies can feel fragile despite wealth and technology. It is interpretive. It lives in the gap between promise and reality. Life expectancy then operates not only as a demographic measure, but as a cultural signal. It tells people what to expect from time. Medieval expectancy signaled caution. Modern expectancy signals optimism. Both shape behavior. Caution fosters restraint. Optimism fosters expansion, expansion enclosure. Modern exposure is diffuse, but psychologically pervasive. One can be exposed to global risk without direct experience. This exposure magnifies fear without offering resolution. Medieval fear had resolution. The storm passed, the harvest came, the illness ended or did not. Modern fear often lingers unresolved. Life expectancy numbers feed this abstraction by framing life as something that should unfold predictably. When unpredictability intrudes, distress escalates. The medieval example invites a recalibration, not toward danger, but toward realism. It suggests that peace emerges not from limiting risk, but from aligning expectation downward, toward what could be managed. Modern people align expectation upward, toward what is statistically likely, but never guaranteed. This upward alignment fuels disappointment when reality deviates. Disappointment erodes trust in systems, in bodies, and in time itself. Medieval trust was not placed in time, it was placed in process. Process could fail, but it could also resume. It allowed life to continue after disruption, without demanding explanation or justification. By following medieval life expectancy beyond the number, we uncover a philosophy of living that does not deny mortality, but incorporates it without allowing it to dominate meaning. Mortality was present but not predictive. It did not define the value of a life. Value arose from engagement, contribution, and persistence within given limits. Modern life expectancy often reverses this relationship. Mortality becomes predictive. It defines planning. It defines fear. It defines success. This predictive weight burdens the present with the future's shadow. Meteor life carried a different shadow. It was the shadow of recent loss. That shadow grounded attention rather than pulling it forward. Both shadows shape consciousness. One stabilizes, the other stretches. As this contrast deepens, it becomes clear that medieval life expectancy continues to matter, not because it tells us how long people lived, but because it reveals an alternative way of inhabiting time. A way that accepted fragility openly, distributed meaning widely, and allowed lives to be lived without constant comparison to an abstract horizon. This way did not make life easier. It made it coherent. And coherence, more than comfort, sustained endurance across centuries of uncertainty. And when coherence replaces projection, another quiet shift occurs, because people stop treating time as a resource to be accumulated and begin treating it as a condition to be navigated. Medieval life expectancy encouraged this navigation instinct constantly. Each day arrived with constraints already present, and value emerged from responding well within them. This mindset reduced the temptation to postpone living until circumstances improved. Improvement was uncertain. Anticipation was immediate. Modern systems invert this logic. They encourage postponement. Live carefully now so that life can be enjoyed later. This bargain appears rational, yet it quietly hollows the present by tying meaning to a future state that may never fully materialize. Medieval people did not bargain with time. They cooperated with it. Cooperation allowed satisfaction to exist alongside risk, rather than waiting for risk to disappear. Function regret was contextual. One regretted specific choices that worsened conditions, not the failure to reach an imagined end. Modern regret is often abstract. People regret not becoming what projections suggested they could become. This abstract regret is heavier because it cannot be corrected. Regret could be addressed through adjustment, change, behavior. Modern regret often fixates on missed trajectory rather than altered conditions. Life expectancy statistics reinforce this fixation by implying that life follows a standard arc. Deviation becomes personal loss. It did not threaten identity. As this contrast settles, the medieval past stops functioning as a cautionary tale. It diagnoses a modern discomfort, with uncertainty that numbers were meant to solve, but have instead amplified. The medieval world shows that endurance does not require certainty. It requires alignment, aligner between expectation and reality. Align between event and outcome, align between individual limits, and put in indivin amot. And a fracture life can feel unbearable even when materially secure. Life expectancy in this sense is not simply about length, it is about posture toward the unknown. Medieval posture was humble, responsive, and grounded. Modern posture is confident, predictive, and stretched. Both achieve survival in different ways. Both generate blind spots. The medieval blind spot was preventable suffering. The modern blind spot is preventable anxiety. Neither is trivial. Understanding both allows a fuller picture to emerge, one that resists nostalgia and triumphalism alike, by returning to the medieval logic of expectancy, not to adopt it, but to understand it. Modern listeners gain a reference point outside projection, a reminder that living does not need to be justified by how long it lasts. It needs to be sustained meaningfully while it unfolds. Medieval people sustain meaning through participation, adaptation, and shared memory. Modern people often seek meaning through anticipation, optimization, and comparison. These strategies pull attention forward. This steadiness did not eliminate fear, it contained it, and containment matters. Fear that is contained informs action. Fear that is projected paralyzes it. Life expectancy as a live structure can either contain fear or amplify it, depending on how it frames time. Media framing contained modern framing often amplifies. It completes it by restoring a dimension of endurance that statistics alone cannot provide. And as this comparison narrows, attention begins to turn inward, because the distance between medieval life and modern life is no longer historical, it is psychological, and the listener can feel it operating quietly in their own routine. Living by projection does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. Plans extend forward. Calendars fill. Health metrics are tracked. Future are simulated repeatedly, not out of fear at first, but out of responsibility. Yet over time, this responsibility accumulates weight. The future becomes crowded with versions of the self that must be protected. Each choice feels consequential beyond its moment. Rest becomes conditional. Even calm carries an undertone of maintenance, because it must be preserved for later. This is where fatigue begins, not in the body but in attention. Attention is pulled forward constantly, monitoring what has not yet happened, rehearsing outcomes that may never arrive. The medieval listener did not live this way, but the modern listener does, often without noticing it as strain. It feels like maturity, it feels like prudence, yet it slowly drains presence. When life is lived against a projected span, moments are rarely allowed to stand alone. They are evaluated. Is this healthy? Is this productive? Is this worth the time? Time itself becomes a resource that must be justified. This justification loop tightens with age. Because the projection sharpens, one becomes increasingly aware of the number ahead. Even if it is never spoken, that number creates an invisible deadline against which experiences are measured. Medieval people did not experience this deadline internally. Their deadline was external and immediate: weather, conflict, hunger. Because risk was visible, time did not need to be abstracted. Modern risk is often invisible. It lives in probabilities. Probabilities invite imagination. Imagination, when unchecked, produces anxiety that feels rational but never resolves. This is why modern people can feel tense even in safety. The phrase "must live long" carries an unspoken demand. It suggests obligation. It implies that longevity is not only desired but required. This requirement reshapes identity subtly. Illness becomes interruption. Aging becomes deviation. Slowing down feels like falling behind. None of this was true in the medieval frame. There was only still here or no longer here. Survival did not need to be justified by duration. It justified itself by continuation. The modern listener, when sitting with this contrast, may recognize a familiar pressure. The pressure to optimize health, not for comfort now but for security later. The pressure to delay satisfaction until it can be enjoyed properly. The pressure to remain vigilant because the future is long and must be protected. Over time, this vigilance becomes exhausting. It turns life into a continuous act of prevention rather than participation. This exhaustion does not come from living too long. It comes from living too far ahead of oneself. Medieval people live close to themselves, close to their limits, close to their environment. Modern people often live several versions ahead, managing contingencies that may never unfold. This management feels responsible, yet it fragments attention. Fragmented attention reduces rest. Reduced rest increases anxiety. Anxiety feeds the sense that something is always at risk. Life expectancy numbers reinforce this cycle by offering reassurance that must be continually maintained. If the average is high, one should be safe. If one feels unsafe, something must be wrong. This disconnect produces self-blame. Medieval people did not blame themselves for uncertainty. Uncertainty was the baseline. As the listener reflects, another realization may surface, that much of modern stress is not about danger, but about anticipation. The medieval rhythm allowed cycles to close, seasons ended, outcomes arrived, loss occurred and was absorbed. Modern anticipation often remains open-ended. The future keeps extending, the ending point recedes. Culmet is podment keeps the nervous system engaged indefinitely. It is difficult to rest when life is framed as preparation for later. Medieval life was not preparation, it was response. Response concludes. Preparation lingers. The demand to live long also reshapes how people relate to meaning. Meaning becomes something to be secured over time, often deferred until conditions are ideal. Medieval meaning was immediate. It was located in contribution now, in presence now, in endurance now. I will enjoy life once this is stable, once that is secured, once I reach that age. This conditionality mirrors life expectancy projection, both promise later, both risk hollowing now. The medieval listener did not wait for later. Later was uncertain, now was available. As this inward turn deepens the comparison with medieval life, it feels personal. The listener may notice how often they measure themselves against imagined futures, how often they feel tension, not because something is wrong, but because something might go wrong. This constant orientation toward might drains emotional energy. Medieval people oriented toward what is, this did not make them fearless. Modern fear is often unbounded because its object is abstract. Abstract fear is harder to contain. This is not an argument to abandon planning or health or foresight. It is an invitation to notice the cost of living entirely by projection. Medieval life expectancy offers a counterexample, not a solution, but a reference point. A reminder that life can be lived without constant justification by duration, that one can participate fully without knowing how long participation will last, that endurance does not require certainty, it requires presence. And presence, once reclaimed, softens the grip of the future enough for the present to feel inhabitable again, even under the quiet pressure of time moving forward. And as the story finally slows, the question that opened everything no longer needs an answer, because it has already changed shape. What life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages is no longer a number waiting to be corrected. It has become a way of seeing, a way of noticing how humans live inside time rather than how long they occupy it. Medieval life expectancy does not resolve into comfort, but it dissolves a misunderstanding. This shows that people did not live with less meaning because life was uncertain. They lived with meaning shaped by uncertainty. Meaning was not postponed, it was practiced, it was renewed each day survival continued. This does not make the medieval world gentle, it makes it intelligible for the modern listener. This realization arrives quietly. It does not demand rejection of progress or denial of medicine or abandonment of planning. It simply loosens the grip of projection. It reminds the mind that living does not require a guaranteed span to be legitimate. That care, effort, and presence do not need a promised future to matter. Medieval people did not wait for life to feel complete. They lived inside incompletion. And that incompletion, accepted rather than resisted, allowed rest to exist alongside danger. Life expectancy, when stripped of its authority as forecast, becomes what it always was, a description after the fact, a shadow cast backward by survival already lived. Medieval people stood in front of that shadow, not inside it. Modern people often stand inside the shadow of a future that has not yet arrived. This inversion explains much of the quiet fatigue that fills modern life. The fatigue of always preparing, of always maintaining, of always measuring oneself against a horizon that keeps moving. The medieval world did not escape fatigue, it experienced it honestly. Fatigue ended in sleep, in rest, in pause. Modern fatigue often does not, because anticipation continues, even when the body lies down. As the mind absorbs this difference, attention naturally slows. There is less urgency to solve the past, less need to correct the number. The story no longer argues, it settles medieval life expectancy, a reminder that endurance is not built only by extending time, but by inhabiting it coherently, that coherence does not come from certainty, it comes from alignment. Alignment between expectation and reality, alignment between effort and outcome, alignment between the body's limits and the world's demands. When alignment holds, life feels livable, even when it is hard. When alignment breaks, life can feel unbearable even when it is safe. This truth runs quietly beneath centuries of change. Technology shifts, medicine advances, numbers rise, yet the human nervous system remains sensitive to mismatch. Medieval people lived in a world where mismatch was expected and managed. Recognizing this does not solve everything. It softens something. It allows the future to loosen its grip just enough for the present to breathe, and so the medieval world recedes again, not as a place of darkness, but as a different posture toward time, a posture that did not promise, did not guarantee, did not project. It responded, it adjusted, it endured. Lives were lost early, lives were lived long. Both were held within the same logic, a logic that did not measure worth by duration, but by participation while possible. That logic still resonates because it speaks to something modern systems rarely address: the need to rest without knowing what comes next, the need to live without constant rehearsal of loss or optimization of survival. As this understanding settles, the question fades, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer presses. What remains is quieter, a sense that life, whether long or short, does not ask to be justified by numbers. It asks to be lived where it is, as it is, until it is not. Medial life expectancy reminds us of that simplicity, not as comfort, as clarity. And clarity, once found, has a way of carrying the mind gently towards stillness, where the future loosens, the past softens, and the present is finally allowed to be enough. And with that understanding fully settled, nothing more needs to be added, only allowed to drift, because the mind has already done the work it needed to do, and now it can rest inside what remains. There is no final argument to make, no correction left unfinished, no number waiting to be fixed. The story has loosened its grip. What stays behind is a slower awareness of time, one that does not rush forward or pull backward, but simply stays where the body already is. Breathing continues. Thoughts arrive more softly. The future no longer presses for rehearsal. The past no longer asks to be explained. This is the quiet space medieval life expectancy points toward when stripped of shock and comparison, not a lesson but a posture. In that posture, living is no longer measured against length. It is felt as continuity, continuity of breath, continuity of small adjustments that require no justification beyond the fact that they are happening. Medieval people lived inside this continuity because they had no alternative. Modern listeners can enter it briefly by choice, by letting the projected future step aside for a moment. Nothing is lost when it does. Plans remain where they are. Numbers remain unchanged. But the nervous system is given permission to stop holding everything at once. When life is no longer framed as something that must reach a certain distance, the body relaxes into the simple task of remaining. Remaining attentive. Remaining responsive. Remaining here. This was never about courage or resignation. It was about alignment alienton that allows effort to rise when needed and settle when it is not. Medieval endurance depended on this settling as much as on action. Rest was not indulgence, it was recovery. Recovery allowed endurance to continue. Without it, survival failed quickly. Modern life often delays rest until conditions feel secure. Medieval life rested whenever rest was possible. That difference still matters, because bodies have not changed as much as expectations. As attention softens, the idea of life expectancy fades into the background where it belongs. It becomes just another description, useful at a distance, unnecessary up close. What matters up close is sensation, warmth, stillness, the quiet recognition that nothing needs to be decided right now. Medieval people did not lie awake calculating how long they might live. They lay awake listening for danger and slept when it was absent. Modern listeners lie awake imagining futures. The medieval posture invites a pause in that imagining, not forever, just long enough for the mind to remember that it does not need to solve time to inhabit it. The medieval world does not offer comfort, it offers honesty. And honesty, when accepted, reduces tension. Tension dissolves when there is nothing left to defend, no promised span to protect, no imagined loss to prevent, only the present condition already unfolding, already sufficient. This sufficiency is subtle, it does not announce itself. It simply allows the body to sink into the surface. It is resting on, the breath to deepen without instruction, the thoughts to lose their urgency. Medieval life expectancy understood properly leads here not to darkness, but to a quiet acceptance that life has always been lived without guarantees, even when numbers suggest otherwise. As the mind follows this acceptance, effort naturally decreases. The story does not need to continue, it can repeat gently or not at all. The themes have already circled enough times to loosen their edges: endurance, alini, uncertainty, presence. These words no longer demand attention. They dissolve into rhythm slows. The listener no longer needs to compare worlds, centuries, or systems. Comparison has served its purpose. What remains is rest. In this rest, there is no requirement to be productive with time, no need to optimize sleep or prepare for tomorrow. Medieval people rested because rest allows survival to resume. Modern listeners can rest because nothing is required of them in this moment. The future will arrive on its own. It does not need to be carried forward manually. The past has already settled. It does not need to be replayed. Between the two there is space. That space is where the story ends. Not with a conclusion, but with a release. Life expectancy recedes completely now, leaving only the experience of being alive without measuring it, breath after breath, moment after moment. Enough without explanation, enough without promise. Enough as it is. And as that release continues, even the idea of an ending becomes unnecessary, because nothing is being concluded, only allowed to quiet. The body remains where it is, the room remains unchanged. Time moves, but without urgency. There is no signal to respond to, no task waiting just beyond this moment. Medieval people did not think of rest as an escape from life. It was part of life's rhythm, arriving naturally when effort could pause. That rhythm still exists even now beneath modern schedules and projections. It does not need to be rebuilt, it only needs space to surface. When attention is no longer stretched forward, sensations become simpler. Breathing becomes noticeable without being controlled. Muscles release without instruction. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer insist on being followed. This is not sleep yet. It is the slowing that makes sleep possible. Medieval nights were not filled with analysis. They were filled with listening, then silence. This moment offers a brief return to silence, where nothing reminds you of how much time remains or how much time has passed. Life expectancy is completely faded now because it was never meant to be held this close. It belongs to distance, to overview, to abstraction. Close in where the body rests, it has no function. Medieval people lived most of their lives at this distance, close to sensation, close to effort, close to rest. Modern listeners can touch that closeness without giving anything up. No decision is required, no belief needs to change. Only attention softens. In this softened state, the future stops demanding rehearsal. Tomorrow can wait. The mind does not need to prepare for it tonight. Whatever comes will come with its own conditions, just as it always has. Medieval people trusted that because they had no alternative. Modern listeners can allow that trust temporarily, knowing that nothing important is being neglected by doing so. Rest is not avoidance. It is alignment returning. The story has already done what it needed to do. It loosened comparison. It slowed judgment. It removed the pressure to measure life against a number. What remains is not an idea, but a feeling of enoughness that does not need to be named. This feeling does not promise comfort. It allows ease. Ease is quieter than comfort. It arrives without excitement. It stays without effort. As this ease spreads, there is no reason to keep listening for meaning. Meaning has stepped aside. The words themselves can begin to blur, becoming texture rather than message. Medieval endurance did not require constant interpretation. It required presence. Presence is already here. Nothing needs to be added to it. And so the mind can drift not away but inward, toward a place where time is no longer something to manage, where life is not being evaluated, where the body is allowed to do what it does naturally when nothing interrupts it. This is where the story finally leaves you, not at an answer, not at a conclusion, but at rest, which has always been the quiet ground beneath every question, waiting patiently to be noticed again. Not as the final thoughts settle, there is nothing left to resolve, no number to correct, no conclusion to defend. The idea of life expectancy loosens its grip, not because it has been disproven, but because it no longer needs to be carried. What remains is a quieter awareness that living was never meant to be endlessly or justified in advance. It was meant to be inhabited moment by moment under conditions that are never fully known. Medieval life expectancy fades here, not as a statistic, but as a reminder that endurance does not come from certainty. It comes from alignment, from meeting each phase of life as it arrives, without demanding guarantees from what comes next. In this light, the pressure to live long softens, the tension around the future eases. Survival is no longer a race toward a projected finish line, but a process unfolding at its own pace. Effort remains, but strain diminishes. Attention returns to what is already present. Breathing, resting, continuing. The medieval world does not offer instruction. It offers contrast, a different way of carrying time, and that contrast is enough to let the mind slow, to release comparison, to stop rehearsing outcomes that have not arrived. Here, nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be extended. Life does not ask to be measured before it can be lived, and in recognizing that the story comes to rest,